Everyone thinks civilization started with agriculture. You plant seeds, you settle down, you build temples. That is the rule. But Göbekli Tepe breaks that rule. It proves we built the temple first, and the farm came later just to feed the workers. It is a complete reversal of human history, and recently technology gave us a look at the invisible architecture connecting these pillars. The precision is mind-blowing. It suggests these primitive people were actually engineering geniuses. What most people don't realize is that this changes the definition of primitive. Geometry before the wheel. Here is the deal. For over 20 years, archaeologists looked at Göbekli Tepe and saw a cluster of stone circles. They were impressive, sure. We are talking about massive limestone pillars arranged in rings, buried deep in the earth. To the naked eye, they looked like separate enclosures, maybe built by different tribes at different times. It felt organic, a bit messy, like a project that just sort of happened over centuries without a master plan. But here is the catch. In the year 2020, researchers decided to run the layout of the site through a spatial algorithm. Basically, they used a computer to look for patterns that the human eye might miss. They analyzed the position of the central pillars in the 3 oldest enclosures. These are massive T-shaped stones that sit right in the middle of the rings. And what the algorithm found was shocking. The center points of these 3 enclosures, which were supposedly built at different times, form a near-perfect equilateral triangle. It is not that simple, though. This isn't just a rough shape. The geometry is precise. It implies that the builders, these people who were supposedly running around chasing gazelles with stone spears, had a floor plan. They understood geometry. They planned the entire complex before they laid the first stone. This changes everything. It means Göbekli Tepe wasn't just a random gathering spot that grew over time. It was a planned architectural marvel. It suggests a level of sophistication and hierarchy that we didn't think was possible for the end of the Ice Age. Think about it. To pull this off, you need architects, you need a foreman, you need a labor force that follows instructions to the inch. We used to think these people lived in small, egalitarian bands of 20 or 30 folks. But to build a geometric complex like this, you need hundreds, maybe thousands of people working in unison. The crazy part is the timeline. This is 12,000 years ago. This is 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the pyramids. At this point in history, humans were still transitioning out of the Ice Age. The world was colder, mammoths were just going extinct. And yet, here in what is now Turkey, someone was laying out a massive construction project using geometric principles. What most people don't realize is that this destroys the dumb caveman narrative. We often look back at our ancestors and think they were simple, but the hidden geometry of Göbekli Tepe proves they had complex minds. They had a vision, and they had the organizational skills to make that vision a reality using nothing but flint tools and muscle. This revelation forces us to ask a terrifying question. If they knew geometry, what else did they know that we have forgotten? The algorithm didn't just find a triangle. It found the fingerprints of a lost way of thinking. A worldview that allowed people to manipulate massive stones with a precision that rivals modern engineers. But the geometry is just the start of the mystery. Because once you understand that they built it, you have to figure out how they moved 50-ton rocks without a single wheel. The answer to the construction method is even wilder than the geometry. The real secret to the construction. Let's get into the heavy lifting. Literally. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe are huge. The biggest ones are 18 feet tall and weigh up to 50 tons. That is the weight of about 7 large elephants. And remember, these people did not have wheels. They did not have beasts of burden, no oxen, no horses. They didn't even have metal chisels. So, how did they do it? Basically, the entire site is a limestone plateau. The builders didn't haul the stones from miles away like they did at Stonehenge. They carved them directly out of the bedrock right under their feet. It was a stroke of genius, but it was also a nightmare of labor. Imagine this. You are standing on a limestone hill. You have a piece of flint or obsidian in your hand, and you have to carve a 20-foot pillar out of the solid ground. You have to chip away channel after channel until the shape emerges. Then, you have to break it free from the base. But here is the catch. Once you break it free, you have to move it. Even moving it a few hundred yards is an impossible task for a small group. You can't just push 50 tons. This implies massive crowds. Estimates suggest it would take at least 500 men to move one of these pillars using ropes and logs. They would have to work in perfect rhythm. One slip and someone gets crushed. It requires incredible coordination, and that brings us to the logistics. If you have 500 guys hauling stones, they need to eat. They need to drink. They can't be out hunting if they are pulling ropes all day. This is where the feasting theory comes in. Archaeologists have found huge vats at the site. These vats contain chemical traces of oxalate, which is a byproduct of brewing beer. That is right, beer. It seems the builders were fueled by massive feasts. The leaders of this project, whoever they were, threw giant parties. They roasted gazelles, they brewed beer, and they invited different clans from all over the region. The deal was simple. You come, you eat, you drink, you worship, and you help us move these rocks. It turns the whole idea of slave labor on its head. This wasn't built by slaves whipped by a tyrant. It was likely built by a cooperative workforce motivated by religion and, frankly, a good party. What most people don't realize is the sheer amount of meat required. We found thousands of animal bones at the site. Gazelle, aurochs, deer. This wasn't a quick snack. This was industrial-scale catering. The crazy part is that this need for food might be what pushed humanity into the next era. You can't hunt enough wild game to feed 500 people indefinitely. Eventually, you have to start managing the herds. You have to start cultivating the wild grasses to make the beer. So, in a way, the difficulty of moving these stones forced them to invent a new way of life. The construction drove the innovation. But let's look closer at the stones themselves. They aren't just big blocks. They are T-shaped. And if you look closely, you will see arms carved on the sides, hands with fingers wrapping around the belly, belts, loincloths. These pillars are people, or giants. They are stylized, faceless figures standing in a circle, looking inward, watching. And the things carved onto them? That is where the real nightmare begins. The artwork at Göbekli Tepe isn't about flowers and sunshine. It is a gallery of predators. And what these predators represent is darker than you think. The Stone Age House of Horrors. Walk through the enclosures, and you won't find peaceful scenes of village life. You won't find carvings of people farming or holding hands. Instead, you are surrounded by teeth and claws. The pillars are covered in high-relief carvings of the deadliest animals in the region: lions, scorpions, snakes, spiders, and the most prominent of them all, the vulture. Why the obsession with dangerous beasts? Some experts think these animals represent guardians. They are protecting the sacred space. If you want to enter the circle, you have to pass the scorpion and the lion. It is a spiritual security system. But here is the catch. The vulture carving tells a different, darker story. In one famous scene, there is a vulture holding a round object that looks suspiciously like a human head. Below it, there is a headless human body. This points to a skull cult. In many ancient cultures, people believed the soul lived in the head. When someone died, they wouldn't bury them in the ground immediately. They would leave the body out on a high platform for the birds to eat. This is called a sky burial. The vultures would pick the bones clean, taking the flesh to the heavens. Then the people would collect the skull and keep it. We have found fragments of human skulls at Göbekli Tepe. Some of them have carved marks on them, as if they were skinned or drilled to be hung up on ropes. Yeah, about that. It implies this beautiful geometric temple was actually a gateway to the afterlife, a place where the dead were processed. The headless body on the pillar isn't a victim of war. It is a depiction of a funeral rite. And get this, the pillars themselves, those giant T-shapes, might represent the ancestors watching over this process. The faceless giants are the dead, looming over the living. There is another theory too. Some researchers believe the animals represent different clans or tribes: the Scorpion clan, the Fox clan, the Snake clan. When these tribes came together to build the site, they carved their totems into the stone to mark their territory or their contribution. The fox is actually the most common animal at the site. But curiously, we don't find many fox bones in the food piles. They were eating gazelle, but they were carving foxes. This suggests the fox was a spiritual symbol, not a dinner menu. maybe a trickster or a guide to the underworld. The crazy part is the detail. These aren't crude drawings. They are 3D sculptures carved out of the flat surface of the pillar. The artists had to chip away the background to make the animal pop out. That takes incredible skill and patience. If you make one mistake, you ruin the whole pillar. This tells us that art and symbolism were just as important to them as survival. They spent precious calories creating these nightmares in stone. But why go to all this trouble? Why build a house of horrors on top of a hill? The answer lies in the impact this site had on the entire world. It wasn't just a temple. It was the spark that burned down the old world. The consequences of this place are still felt today. The engine of civilization. For the longest time, the story of humanity was simple. It was a straight line. We were told that for thousands of years, humans were simple nomads. We wandered around, chased gazelles, picked berries, and slept in temporary shelters. We were primitive. According to the old history books, the big change happened when we discovered farming. The theory was that someone planted a seed, realized it would grow, and decided to settle down to watch it. Because we stopped moving, we built villages. Because we had villages and a surplus of grain, we had free time. And only then, with a full belly and a roof over our heads, did we have the luxury to think about big questions. We invented religion. We built temples. We created art. Farm first, temple second. Civilization was supposed to be the result of a full stomach. But Göbekli Tepe takes that history book, rips it in half, and throws it in the fire. When Klaus Schmidt and his team started digging into that Turkish hillside, they didn't find what they were supposed to find. If the old theory was right, there should have been houses. There should have been trash pits full of domesticated wheat. There should have been evidence of a settled farming village. There was none of that. There were no hearths for cooking daily meals. There were no messy piles of residential trash. And most importantly, there was absolutely zero evidence of farming. The bones found at the site were wild gazelle, wild boar, and wild deer. The plant remains were wild grasses. These were hunter-gatherers. They were supposed to be worrying about where their next meal was coming from. They weren't supposed to have the time, the energy, or the organization to build anything larger than a hut. And yet, they built the first skyscraper of the ancient world. So, here's the deal. The timeline is backwards. The urge to worship, to gather, and to build something monumental didn't come after civilization. It came before. The human need for connection, ritual, and awe was the engine. Farming was just the fuel they eventually invented to keep that engine running. Think about the sheer impossibility of what they did. We are talking about limestone pillars weighing 10, maybe 20 tons. That is the weight of a fully loaded city bus. And they didn't have wheels. They didn't have beasts of burden like oxen or horses. They didn't have metal tools. No bronze chisels, no iron saws. They had flint. They had stone, and they had human muscle. To move just one of those pillars from the quarry to the enclosure would require hundreds of people pulling on ropes, working in perfect sync. It would require engineers to figure out the leverage. It would require leaders to organize the teams, and someone had to feed those hundreds of workers. This brings us to the cathedral analogy. Think about the Middle Ages in Europe. A small poor town would decide to build a massive cathedral. It would take 100 years. It would cost a fortune. Why did they do it? They did it because it unified the community. It gave them a center. It was a place to connect with the divine. Göbekli Tepe was the Stone Age cathedral. It was a beacon on a hill, visible for miles in every direction. It wasn't a place where people lived. It was a place where people came together. Imagine the scene 12,000 years ago. You are a nomad. You live in a small band of maybe 30 people. You spend your life walking, hunting, surviving. But at certain times of the year, you see the smoke rising from the Potbelly Hill. You make the pilgrimage. When you arrive, you meet other bands of people you've never seen before. You see these massive stone circles lit by flickering torches. The pillars aren't just rocks, they are carved with terrifying 3D reliefs. Lions, scorpions, vultures, spiders. They loom over you in the firelight. It is a sensory overload. And there is feasting. Archaeologists have found massive stone vats that show chemical traces of brewing. They were making beer. They were roasting huge amounts of meat. This wasn't just a construction site. This was a party. It was a ritual center that acted as the social glue for a massive area. And here's the part that changes everything we know about the scale of this society. For a while, we thought Göbekli Tepe was a lonely genius, a single freak occurrence. But we were wrong. In the last few years, archaeologists have started looking at the surrounding hills. They found Karahan Tepe. They found Sayburç. They found Sefer Tepe. They are calling it Tas Tepeler, the stone hills. These aren't just little outposts. Karahan Tepe has pillars that are just as impressive, if not stranger, than Göbekli Tepe. It has a chamber carved directly into the bedrock with stone phalluses protruding from the wall and a human head carved as part of the rock, staring at the entrance. What this tells us is that Göbekli Tepe wasn't an isolated accident. It was the hub of a massive network. This implies a complex society spread across a huge geographic area. These different groups of hunter-gatherers shared a culture. They shared a religion. They shared the same artistic style. They weren't isolated savages fighting for survival in the dark. They were part of a civilization that we are just beginning to understand. They had the ability to coordinate labor across hundreds of miles. They had a shared belief system strong enough to make them drag 20-ton stones up a hill. And they did it all without writing, without metal, and without kings. It was a golden age of cooperation. But as we are about to see, this massive social experiment might have been too successful for its own good. The very thing that brought them together, the hunger for ritual and connection, forced them to invent something that would change the world forever, and ultimately, it would destroy their way of life. The trap of success and the great burial. So we have this massive cathedral on the hill. We have hundreds, maybe thousands of people gathering for these festivals. We have workers dragging stones. We have sculptors carving intricate foxes and cranes into the rock. But all these people have one problem. They need to eat. You can't feed a workforce of 500 men just by gathering wild almonds and hoping a gazelle runs by. The logistics of the cathedral created a pressure cooker for innovation. They needed a reliable food source. They needed a way to guarantee that when the pilgrims arrived, the feast was ready. This is where the story of Göbekli Tepe collides with the story of our dinner tables today. Geneticists have analyzed the DNA of modern wheat, the stuff in your toast, your pizza crust, your beer. They traced its lineage back to its wild ancestor, einkorn wheat. And do you know where the closest genetic match for that wild ancestor grows? It grows on the slopes of the Karakada Mountains, just 20 miles from Göbekli Tepe. This is ground zero for bread. It seems that in their effort to feed the temple, these hunter-gatherers started experimenting. They didn't just pick the wild grass, they started tending it. They saved the biggest seeds. They cleared fields. They invented agriculture not because they wanted to stop moving, but because they needed to fuel the religion. But here's the catch. Farming changes people. Once you plant a field, you are trapped. You can't wander off for 6 months to hunt. You have to stay and weed. You have to stay and water. And most importantly, you have to stay and defend it. If you have a barn full of wheat and your neighbor is starving, he's going to come for it. So you build a wall. You invent property. You invent weapons of war. Suddenly, society shifts. In the hunter-gatherer days, things were relatively equal. If a leader was a jerk, you just walked away and joined another group. But now you are tied to the land. You have wealth to accumulate. We start seeing evidence of social hierarchy. The big man takes charge. Inequality starts. The egalitarian life of the hunter-gatherer dies, killed by the very invention that made the temple possible. It is a tragedy of progress. They built the temple to bring people together, but the farming required to support the temple eventually tore the old world apart. And then something incredibly strange happened. After about 1,000 years of use, which is a mind-boggling amount of time, the people of Göbekli Tepe did something that baffles archaeologists. They didn't just abandon the site. They didn't just walk away and let the roof collapse. They buried it. This wasn't a natural process. It wasn't a landslide. It was a deliberate Herculean effort. They hauled tons of limestone rubble, dirt, and refuse up the hill and dumped it into the enclosures. They carefully packed the statues. They filled the circles all the way to the top. They erased their cathedral from the landscape. Why? This is one of the biggest mysteries in archaeology. Why spend decades building something, use it for centuries, and then spend years burying it? Maybe the old religion died. Maybe the shift to farming made the old hunter cult obsolete. The animals on the pillars, the scorpions, the vultures, were symbols of the wild world. Maybe the new farmers feared the wild, or maybe it was a revolution. Some archaeologists suggest that the skull cult, evidence of which we see in the way they treated human remains, became too powerful. Maybe the priesthood became corrupt. Maybe the people rose up, rejected the old gods, and buried the temple to keep the spirits, or the priests, inside. We don't know for sure, but the irony is that by burying it, they saved it. If they had left it open, the Christians, the Romans, or the Byzantines would have smashed the pagan stones to build their own churches. By sealing it in dirt, they created a perfect time capsule that waited 12,000 years for us to open it. But before we wrap this up, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather the alien in the room. What we still don't know creates a vacuum, and the internet loves to fill that vacuum with aliens or Atlantis. It is easy to look at the geometric perfection of Göbekli Tepe and say humans couldn't have done it. The pillars are arranged in perfect equilateral triangles. The layout shows a grasp of geometry that supposedly wasn't invented until Pythagoras thousands of years later. So, what do you think? Was Göbekli Tepe a temple, a celestial observatory, or something else entirely? And why did they bury it? Let me know your theories in the comments below. If you want to see more mysteries unraveled like this, smash that like button and subscribe. See you in the next one.